Okay, so it's a little after 7. We are recording, as you just heard. So if anyone's late, they can catch up with the recording. And in interest of time, we're going to get going. I'm just going to repeat that we are in a webinar format tonight, which means you will not be able to turn on your cameras. We are able to let you unmute yourself if you really want to ask a question out loud. Otherwise, please use the Q&A feature. It's set up that you can see the other questions that have been asked and upvote them if you have the same question. And that way we can prioritize based on the number of people who have shared a question if we're running short on time towards the end. If you would like to put your question in the chat, you can do that as well. But the Q&A is built for that feature. And I will turn it over to Suzanne.
Muted, Suzanne. Unmute.
Good start. Thank you. So, good evening, all, and welcome to the third of 9 workshops in our Sustainable Landscape series. My name is Suzanne Barclay, and I'm the Executive Director of Cornell Cooperative Extension of Rockland. Tonight, we're beyond excited to have Dr. Nina Bassick as our speaker. Since you've joined us tonight, you're likely aware that water conservation is of special concern in Rockland. And that's because our drinking water supply essentially comes from the rain that falls within our borders and actually makes it into our aquifers or reservoirs. A USGS analysis by hydrologist Paul Heisig, published about 10 years ago, determined that our problem in Rockland is that we use the most water at the worst possible time. Our peak water usage occurs during the driest months in the summer, when there's the most evaporation from our reservoirs and the least rainfall. And that's when we're watering our gardens, our lawns, washing cars, filling swimming pools, things like that. The good news is that conserving water in Rockland is one of the few environmental problems where we can actually each make a difference. So it's hard to say that about a lot of other environmental issues, think climate change or plastic pollution, but water conservation is actually not difficult. It's not particularly painful, and it saves you money. Hence, our series focus on outdoor water use and conservation. All of these workshops are designed to give you specific steps to take to reduce water use in your yard. Our July workshop will focus on soil health and water conservation, presented by Master Gardener volunteer Donna D'Souza. And then in August, we'll be presenting a workshop on composting. And not to worry, we will alert you to these upcoming workshops. So just a few housekeeping issues that Charlie has actually already gone over. Because we're a large group tonight, everyone is muted. Feel free to ask questions either in the Q&A preferably or in the chat. And when Dr. Bassick has finished speaking, we'll get to your questions. If you have any other feedback for us or questions, feel free to email us at rockland@cornell.edu. Finally, I want to thank our funders, New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, the Hudson River Estuary Program, and the New York State Water Resources Institute. Also, our communications manager, Charlie Payne, is the person who actually makes this all work. Dr. Nina Bassick needs little introduction here in Rockland, where she is well known, especially among our Master Gardener volunteers and gardeners in general. But I'm going to introduce her anyway. Dr. Bassick is a professor and director of the Urban Horticulture Institute of the School of Integrative Plant Science at Cornell University. Her focus is on plants in the urban environment, particularly trees, and she's written a book entitled Trees in the Urban Landscape for landscape architects and growers, as well as over 100 papers addressing in urban plants. Dr. Bassick, the screen is all yours.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. I'm delighted to be here to chat with you all, whether you're there or not. I can see your faces. So today I'm going to be focusing on water in the landscape and two different tacks, really. One is looking at the issue of green infrastructure and how municipalities and communities can stop stormwater and increase water infiltration into the soil. And the second part will be looking at more generally improving soil so that we get more infiltration in whether it's your garden or a larger landscape. And so there'll be some research we've done on that, which I will also talk about plants that will be doing well in those kinds of situations. So let's get started. Let's see here. We talk about green infrastructure, which is basically using plants and soils to create ecosystem services, which are things that we value very much in our landscape, whether it's stormwater reduction, water and air quality improvement, energy conservation, carbon sequestration, urban heat mitigation, and creation of habitats for animals and so on. So all plants and soils together can give us these kind of ecosystem services, and we value them, and we can actually quantify the value of them for all communities. So let's see. So we're going to talk about stormwater for a minute, because a lot of communities are dealing with stormwater events, whether it's hurricanes or large rainfalls in summer. So stormwater is rain or snowmelt that does not infiltrate directly into the soil. Why is this? Because over time, we have a lot more impervious surface in the US, estimated at 43,000 square miles and 400 square miles being added every year. So lots more impervious surfaces. That means roads, parking lots, sidewalks, asphalt, that does not allow water in. So water has to go somewhere. It then often can be a flooding situation. Also, compacted soils also have reduced water infiltration. And that's another issue dealing with development and construction in urban environments, which can create soils that do not allow water to infiltrate. And also increases in stormwater tax the capacity of stormwater combined stormwater sewer plants. So that can be quite a problem for, I know many communities have combined stormwater sanitary plants, and New York City being one, and other ones all over the country. So we don't want to tax one to overflow the other. So traditional development may result in large impacts downstream at regional watershed scale. And this is just a Route 81 inundated with water. You can see the road going up in the distance, but it was flooded. And this happens more than we'd like it to. So the issues, stormwater, sedimentation, and trash can be increased, stream bank erosion. We can get excess nutrients, organic and hydrocarbon pollution due to stormwater, flooding, bacterial contamination, pesticide poisoning, road salt contamination. All these things can come in stormwater to create problems in our streams and lakes. So there are stormwater infiltration practices, which are generally called bioswales, and that may be, you might think of as a rain garden, bioswales, detention basins. They're all different types of techniques that basically are trying to help infiltrate water into the ground. So bioswales are one which are stormwater runoff conveyance and infiltration system that slows, directs, cleans, and help infiltrate stormwater into the ground. And plants assist with stormwater infiltration and provide ecological value, such as creating habitat, reducing urban heat island effects. So we have, I'm going to show you about a little bit of, here's one thing that we can think about in terms of how water moves in the landscape. If you look from the top, we've got precipitation or rain coming into where a tree. In a light rainfall event, as you can all remember, if you've gone into a light rainfall, if you want to get out of the rain, you go under a tree. And because tree canopies intercept a tremendous amount of water at when it's a slow rainfall. And then that can evaporate back into the air. But in a heavier rainfall, we've got water going in from the tree into the ground. And also the trunks of trees help water get into the ground through something called stem flow. And when you get to the ground, you have hopefully a pervious surface where water can infiltrate and percolate into the ground. But if you have an impervious surface, whether it's pavement or you have compacted soil, water will run off and not infiltrate. In the soil, of course, we have a tremendous amount of water holding capacity in the soil, which is going to help grow our plants and help replenish our aquifers and so on. Roots take up soil moisture, increasing the ability, actually roots take up, increasing ability to take water to take up. Roots actually create channels in the soil, which increases infiltration. And then when you get back to the surface, if you have a plant, a grass or some other plants, you can have evapotranspiration. So something on the surface of the grass or whatever that was underneath the tree will evaporate and then transpirate as well. And then the roots take up the water into the canopy and transpire it out through their leaves and through the stomates in their leaves. So you have basically a circular situation here where hopefully you get lots of water in the soil to help grow the plants that help do all the ecosystem services we want. So this is let's just show you a little case study here we did on the Cornell campus. This was Tower Road, which is a long spine of road on the Cornell campus. And for many, many years, we had nose-in parking along this road and very poor drainage. And any water that did puddle in this area went into storm drains and into our lakes and causing pollution there. So about 2013, 14, the parking was removed. And the idea was to put a bioswale along this 1/4 mile stretch of Tower Road, take the parking away, put a sidewalk in, and have a bioswale which would capture the water from the road and infiltrate it into the soil and also grow plants that would be able to cool the atmosphere, create habitat, and do all the other things we want plants to do. So we took this challenge on as my class, and we actually did the design and planting of it. So here's 2014. In September, our class is planting the 1/4 mile stretch of this area. You can see there are curb cuts there. There's an 8-foot sidewalk where the parking used to be, and a 5-foot wide, 5 to 6 foot wide bioswale, which is meant to capture water and grow plants to reduce flooding and increase the water infiltration. So this is the general dimensions of this. Basically, you have a curb cut or an inlet in the curb, which allows water from the road to get into the gravel area and then into the soil, which is adjacent to it. The way we design this, we have engineered soil, basically a specified sandy loam to have good infiltration, yet good water holding capacity with about 5% organic matter. We have in a filter fabric separating an open gravel basin below the soil, which would be a storage area for excess water. And this is the idea of how we design this. You can see the curb cut there, water going into the soil and into the storage area below that. So here's the bioswale being built, and you can see the gravel in the basin of this area. We actually, Cornell decided they wanted to have a perforated pipe as well, just in case water came up to the surface. That wouldn't happen. It really wasn't necessary to have that, but Cornell being Cornell, they decided to have belts and suspenders on this. So the aggregate is an important part of this green infrastructure because it's open, graded, clean, durable aggregate. It provides about 35 to 40% porosity, which is a storage or reservoir for excess water. And so it can hold tremendous amount of water and then allow that to gradually seep into the soil below. So here it is being built. You can see the gravel, and then there's a filter fabric, a geotextile, separating the soil from the aggregate so that the soil wouldn't clog up the pores of the aggregate. So why use plants? They provide infiltration channels. As I mentioned, roots actually provide channels that help water get into the soil. They take up pollutants like heavy metals. They help to hold the soil together, reducing erosion. They slow runoff and reduce suspended solids. That's any kind of material that's in the water. Add aesthetic value, improve air quality, reduce the urban heat island. They sequester atmospheric carbon through photosynthesis and increase the habitat for animals. So here we are, it's my class, me, and we're starting to plant this 1/4 mile long strip. You can see in the lower foreground, there's a curb cut. There are curb cuts all along this area, which allow water to get in from the road into a channel of gravel and then seep both left and right into the soil surrounding them. This is what in the September of 2014, what looked like was finished. It see the big infiltration channels, lots of plants. We had many different plants we were trying out to see which ones would do well. In this rather narrow bioswale, I mean, typically bioswales can be larger than this, but we knew we were going to have issues in terms of salt because we have both the sidewalk being salted and the road being salted. And so we chose plants that we thought would be able to withstand de-icing salt. And yes, we do have winter. So there's the bioswale covered with snow. And I said, well, this is great. You know, a little insulation. There's little plants coming through it. But if it just was like this, it would be fine. Of course, this is what it looked like later on. Lots of dirty, salty snow piled on top of the bioswale and not a plant to be seen. But we had faith, and the next spring, there they are, the plants again growing. It's about June of 2015, and they're starting to really take over that area. Salt, yes, you can see a pink line in the middle of a horizontal line. That's above which we have damage to plants. So there were several times when we had high salt levels where we had to expect that there would be salt damage on the plants. And so our choice of plants was important. Also, though, another part of the way we designed this bioswale is that because we have good drainage and because salt is very soluble, by the time the plants are really growing in the spring, that salt would have been dissolved and moved down through the soil into the gravel below, and then eventually down beyond that. So we could expect that we would, later in the season, we would all that salt would disappear. And that's what did happen. But initially, especially in March, February, March, we had a lot of salt on that site. What plants are best? Well, a lot of people use herbaceous plants in bioswales or rain gardens, but they require pruning to remove dead foliage, and whereas woody plants require less pruning, reducing the overall amount of maintenance. So here's a rain garden, another type of bioswale where you have a rain or stormwater or rainwater being channeled into this low area, and hopefully there's a reservoir drainage below that. And a lot of herbaceous plants, a few trees, and that's okay in the summer, but in the winter, it can be a pretty dire situation where you've got lots of herbaceous plants with dead stems, and it just doesn't look very good in the winter. So we've chosen to really use woody plants as well as beyond herbaceous plants. We use a few herbaceous, but the spine or the structure of our bioswales is woody plants. So let's talk about a little bit about the plants. Now, I've seen a lot of bioswales and green infrastructure where basically the choice is made to choose wet tolerant plants. Well, as you know, it doesn't rain all the time, and we can have times where it's really hot and dry. Last August here, we had 6 weeks of not a drop of rain. And so we had to choose plants that are both wet and dry tolerant, and hopefully salt tolerant as well. So this is a tall order, and we've been choosing plants and studying plants that do well in these type of situations. Sometimes we actually look at plants in seashore environments to see if they also get the salt, and sometimes they'll get inundated with salt water and then be dry again, sandy kind of soil. So sometimes we look at natural environments to find plants that might do well in these specialized types of bioswales. So here's some creeping willow, shining sumac, eastern groundsel, something you might not be so familiar with, Baccharis, which is, you can see in the New Jersey swamps, sorbus of sorbifolia, false aurelia, of course, bayberry, which of course the name has changed, Hippophae rhamnoides, Sprite, which is a sea buckthorn, and our buttonbush, our native buttonbush. Sugar shack is a dwarf, a red fruited variety. So these are some of the plants we tried. So this is shining sumac, Rus copulina. This is a more dwarfer form, a beautiful plant. I can see it native in the shore areas. I know I've looked there, I've found it in Brooklyn and Queens near the ocean. Salix repens is a willow, but it's a creeping willow. It's more drought tolerant than some of the other willows we have, and it's also quite beautiful gray foliage. There's the creeping willow with the wind, actually creates some movement, and beautiful. This is summer 2016. Rus copulina shining sumac, you see this in the native shore landscapes, and it has this beautiful fall color, this red fall color, which is really striking. And it's also very tolerant of both wet and dry soils. Bayberry, or Morella pennsylvanica, is our native plant that we see all year near the seashore with the gray berries and the waxy berries. And this also does well in this situation. This is Baccharis halamifolia, the eastern groundsel I mentioned before, which is not very known, but perhaps the most tolerant plant that we've chosen. You see, this is dioecious, meaning there are male flowers on one plant and female flowers on another. The male flowers are the yellow and the female are the white. And so this blooms very, very late, probably into early October, and has great basically impact at that time of the year when there's not much else going on. It is a seashore plant, and it does exceptionally well both in dry and wet and salty soils. Sea buckthorn, European seashore native. This is a dwarf one called Sprite, and it has a beautiful gray foliage. It actually fixes its own nitrogen with the bacterium in the soil, so it can grow in very, very poor nutrition soils. Our native buttonbush, or Cephalanthus occidentalis. This is found in bogs and swampy areas in the eastern US. And we just decided to try it because, well, we decided to try it. And beautiful plant, can get quite tall. At least the straight species can be about 4 to 6 feet, well, 4 to 5 feet. But we put it in there to see how it would do. And surprising, it's actually very drought tolerant as well. Not that you know it from where its native habitat is, but this is the dwarf one, Sugar Shack, which the red fruits, a little bit smaller, a little bit more manageable than the straight species. But surprisingly, Cephalanthus not only is wet tolerant, is dry tolerant. And that's what we're looking for these bioswales, those plants that will tolerate extremes of wet and dry. Rus aromatica, fragrant sumac, the grow low variety here, as you see, with its late fall color. This also is a very tough tree, tough shrub that will grow in wet and dry conditions. And finally, our winterberry, or Ilex verticillata, a great shrub. There are dwarf and there are taller forms. This one is called winter red, which has great berries in the winter and is quite tolerant of wet and dry soils. Okay, so don't worry, we've learned about this is it's best to plant in spring, not autumn, because plants need to become established before they get hit by the winter snow, ice, and salt. So although we planted in September, we found we lost a few plants due to the fact that they really weren't established. So spring establishment is best. We try to plant for canopy closure within the first 2 seasons. Canopy closure is really when the plants or shrubs touch each other. So there's less weed pressure when plant foliage covers the soil and reduces light penetration. And we don't want to be weeding this. So after 1 or 2 seasons, you should have canopy closure and not much in the way of weeds. In early spring, our big maintenance is cutting back dormant stems to maintain height control and removing damaged stems due to salt damage. We also like to mulch this until we have canopy closure, and then the plants themselves make their own mulch. So I'm going to change tacks here now and talk about something else that we are dealing with and have done a lot of research in the last 20 odd years, which is dealing with compacted soil. And just as we don't have infiltration with pavement, asphalt, concrete, and so on, with compacted soil, we also don't get infiltration. So we get runoff and we can get difficult situations for plants to grow in. And this is a ubiquitous problem for plants in cities where there's been development, where there's been utility repair, any kind of construction, where there's tremendous amount of heavy machinery on the soils and cars and so on. And there's just a lot of destruction of the soil. So we decided to work on this a few decades ago and come up with some interesting ideas. So not only is compaction really dense, so the roots can't actually get through it. I mean, it's like a brick. Also, because of the pores of the soil being crushed, water doesn't infiltrate. So we get runoff, we get poor drainage, and also that's a difficult situation for plant roots. So either poor drainage and dense soils are the two major issues that compaction causes. So this is I'm going to show you 2 little case studies. Here's one area of the Cornell campus, and you see on the left, there's a new addition to the library. And this little triangle area was sort of dewatering, the dumping of all kinds of junk when they were doing the construction of that addition was put into this area and then covered up. You can grow grass on anything. But the library and Cornell asked us to do a garden here as part of a 2004 celebration of Cornell's Roberts Hall centennial. And so we said, oh, sure, we'll take on this site. And it was probably the most difficult site I've ever worked on. So when we started getting into the soil, this is what we found. It was like modeling clay and stone and rubble and really, really poor drainage. Water didn't drain. It would rain, water would be there for a week unless it was evaporated. But so really poor drainage, very bad soils. And here you can see we get the gray blue soils. That's telling you there's no oxygen. Where you have a rust color, you have a little bit of oxygen there, but the blue-gray color is a real good indicator that there's no oxygen in the soil because of poor drainage. So all these conditions we decided to work with. And so we developed this thing called the scoop and dump method of soil remediation. And most of the time we do something that's pretty simple in a way. We've now done it over 20 different sites. We apply a layer of 6 inches of compost right on top of the compacted soil. And using a backhoe bucket, we dig down to 15 to 18 inches down into the soil and lift the bucket with the topsoil and compost and feet in the air and then dump it. Hence scoop and dump. The soil compost is dropped into the ground and smooth. Generally, landscape plants are directly planted into this mix, and surface mulch is added every year to replenish organic matter until we reach canopy closure. Now, what we get with this digging and putting in compost is that we get veins of compost through this very cloddy, compacted soil. And we don't rototill it, we don't do anything where we're going to destroy more structure than we already have. And we find that the plants find the veins of compost and they grow very well in this. And over time, I'm not going to show you all the research on this. Over time, we actually get better soil conditions and better soil health by using this method initially, and then mulching and using the correct plants, of course. So in that site, we first used to have our students do the mixing of compost to soil, but you know, they're good, but they can't get that far down. So we also use the condition or the situation of creating a landscape bed on top of really poor soil, or creates greater rooting volume, easier to plant roots to establish and more consistent water movement into the bed, and easier to plant once the bed is prepared. So on top of this really bad soil, we got soil mixed with compost. We created these landscape beds, slightly raised islands through the site. And after this is the first year plants were planted, you see an awful looking sculpture in the back, which I've now covered up with vines. And over time, this is 2004, 2006, you can see the mounds, the amended soil. Plants really grew well on this site. Here they are, growing exceptionally well when we have a really good amended soil in raised beds, not highly raised, but basically moderately raised beds into this situation. So we did some other areas, which I'd like to show you. So the point of showing you this compaction is that you have to get water into the ground, so that water is being held, stored for plant growth, and also stored so we don't get runoff. So dealing with compaction is a key part of this. So here's another construction site on Cornell. There's a library to the left, and for 3 years there was a construction site on the Cornell campus. You can see the dumpsters, the trucks, and cars, and everybody was just driving around all over the place. And so once it was done, and all the construction debris was brought out, campus said to us, "Can you just design and plant a garden in front of this library?" And we had 2 trees that were existing, but everything else was basically nothing. And we decided we needed to do a scoop and dump method on this. So here again, looking at getting that backhoe in there. We don't use students anymore. I mean, they're great for planting, but doing this kind of really deep incorporation of compost makes all the world of difference. So 6 inches of compost down to 15 to 18 inches, and then we get this great veins of compost through the compacted soil. So this is the first year. This was 2010 when we first planted this garden in front of the library. We had areas for people to sit, because there's a little sort of coffee shop inside, and people would like to come out and drink their coffee and chat. This is 2 years later, 2012. Really things are growing up and getting canopy closure, where the shrubs are touching each other, and we don't have to mulch anymore. And then this is 2012, 2020. So plants have grown up, the surface is covered, we've got great plant growth. You could put a shovel in there and go right down as deep as you like, because using this compost soil condition, we get really good non-compacted soil. And interestingly, over time, the microorganisms that are fed by the compost increase the aggregation or the structure of the soil. So we get great infiltration, great root growth. And as you can see, this is 8 years on, and it's really growing well. So just another thing about water. I hope no one does this thing. It's called volcano mulching. Mulch is a great thing for keeping water in the ground and not letting it evaporate away, but not this way. So this is volcano mulching, where we mounding mulch around the tree, and you can see as it's pulled away, we've got fungus and possibly infection in that trunk. So mulch is great. We want to have it not touching the trunk at all, but spread around a nice radius, at least 3 to 5 feet, and about 2 to 3 inches of mulch. Shredded bark is fine. It does wonders for increasing the organic matter in the soil, but not this method. We like to see it spread around Again, we don't actually touch the trunk of the tree with the mulch. It's just a few inches away and spread out around it. So talked about a number of different things, but I'd like to make sure that you get some resources that you can learn about what we've done. And there's a booklet on my website called Woody Shrubs for Stormwater Retention Practices. And it's not just for shrubs I mentioned, but many other ones, which we found work well in these challenging conditions, both for salt, for poor nutrition of the soil, and wet and dry conditions. So on each of these pages of this booklet, here's a Cephalanthus. There's a description about it, all about its environmental tolerances and a bit about its native range and where it pests and diseases, and ornamental characteristics. And on the right-hand side, you see ecological effects, what kinds of services it provides for butterflies, bees, pollinators, whatever nature issues that can be supported by these plants. So we try to give you in one page enough information that you can make good choices about your plant selection. Also on my website, there's something called a Woody Plant Database, where you can see on the top left, you can just put in a name of a plant and press search, and you get a page worth of pictures and information. Or you can do something, you can press search the database, and you can then put in the conditions that you have, the hardiness zone, the pH of the soil, the drainage, the light condition, many different environmental conditions, and then press search, and you get a whole, and also if you want a shrub or a tree or a vine, you can press search and get a whole list of plants that might do well in those conditions. And then you can make further choices yourself, whether it's a good tree, if it's disease prone, or if it's weak wooded, or if it's shrub, whether it might be invasive. So you can choose beyond that, but this gives you the way of choosing in terms of the environmental conditions you find in the site. So this is my website, where it has all kinds of information on, including the booklets and the web and the database I just showed you. So please take this down, because there's all kinds of videos and bulletins, and we keep on adding to it so that it's a living website with all the research we've done over 41 years. So we hope it's useful for people in many different walks of life, whether it's municipalities, whether it's environmental organizations, whether it's homeowners. So we hope that this will be useful for you. And questions. I haven't run too long, but I always like to show this picture because you never can tell where a tree will grow coming out of a window. And that happens to be Paulownia, which is an amazing tree that will grow in, I guess, in the window. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer some.
So Dr. Basak, we have one question, which asks, what do you suggest when there are natural springs on a residential property?
Natural springs?
Springs.
Oh, springs. Lucky you. I mean, so you have a consistently wet condition. There are many plants that will do well in consistently wet conditions. What's more difficult is finding ones that do well in wet and dry. But a spring would be a consistently wet condition, and there are many, many wetland plants that will do well for that. If you went into the Woody Plant Database, you can click on consistently wet soil conditions, and you find a whole range of plants that would do well there.
Okay. Another question, is there a difference between a rain garden and a bioswale?
They're just two different terms. A rain garden, generally considered a place where you channel rainwater. It can be from a downspout, can be from just sloping sidewalks. The rain gardens I've seen that do well also have a gravel layer underneath to increase the infiltration. By just making a low spot in the landscape, you're going to have a puddle It's not necessarily conducive for plant growth. We want to have infiltration, not just water standing on the surface. So they're just two different terms of, whereas bioswales are more general terms of many different types of stormwater runoff effects.
Can you address or make some suggestions for herbaceous or woody plants that don't use a lot of water? Because that's what we're really trying to focus on, you know, in our residential landscapes.
Yeah. Oh, there's some great plants. One of my favorite shrubs is the smoke tree or smoke bush. It's incredibly drought tolerant. If you're looking for shrubs, that one is great. The Caryopteris is a great drought tolerant shrub. Hypericum, great drought tolerant shrub. These are low shrubs, but then if you're looking at trees, golden rain tree, probably one of the toughest drought tolerant trees, the top 5 I have in my mind. That would be one of them. Some of the elms, some of the new hybrid elms are exceptionally tough. They do both wet and dry. Let me think of some other ones. I'm not sure if you're looking at trees, shrubs, or whatever.
Well, any of them.
So again, going into the woody plant database, you can click on long-term drought conditions, or you have basically you can say consistently wet, you can say moist, well drained, you can say occasionally droughty, or you can say very droughty. So you can click on very droughty and your type of plant that you're interested in and get a whole list of those that would do well in your area.
Great. Here's another question. Do you think that the burlap wrapping can be used instead of volcano mulching?
Burlap wrapping around the trunk or in the soil? Where are we talking about?
Well, let's see. Mr. Barrett, can we unmute him, Charlie? Let's assume it's around the trunk.
Well, we don't try to wrap trees anymore, especially in the summertime, because they harbor insects. They make little nice homes for insects. They used to wrap trees with paper wrapping, supposedly to help thin bark trees weather the winter, but we found that they actually cause more harm than good. So we don't recommend wrapping at all, except I often use this kind of slinky type wrap just to prevent deer from rubbing on a nice straight trunk. And I take it off first thing in the spring. So that would be one reason. But in terms of the mulching, you have organic mulch of some sort would be the best thing. Again, 2 to 3 inches deep and a wide radius around the trunk. And I'm not sure burlap comes into that. But.
Okay, thank you. Another question regarding the sea buckthorn you showed. Does that bear edible berries?
Yeah, so the sea buckthorn I showed was a male sterile form, just a male, so it doesn't. But if you get sea buckthorn, the regular plant, it is a dioecious, in other words, a male and female. It's much taller and it bears edible orange colored berries that are prized for making juice, very high in vitamin C. I can't say the plant is gorgeous. It's very rangy, but it tolerates seawater inundation. In other words, it's planted in places where you get stormwater with salty water coming in toward it. So it's very tough. And the female bears orange fruits that are made into juice.
A member of our audience asked, what mulch do you recommend the most, especially for native plant gardens?
I recommend shredded bark mulch. I want something that's going to break down and feed the microorganisms in the soil. I do not use any kind of rock or other type of mulch. Anything that's going to be organic, that's going to be basically non-toxic. I don't use compost for mulch. Well, that goes in the soil, but the mulch will break down slowly over time in a year or so and feed the microorganisms. And I think that's done very, very well.
Would you like to address whether you think native plants are better to use than non-native?
I always get this question. Well, I always say that, all plants are native somewhere. And in our urban environments, we don't have conditions that are anything like what the native condition it was when it was before we had development, construction, people, cars, roads. So the environment has been changed by all of our activities. And so just plonking a native plant in because it was native in 1492 doesn't tell us that it's going to do well. So what I am not against native plants. I am not against non-native plants. I am for plants that are well adapted to the site conditions and are not invasive. And they are disease resistant and do what we expect them to do. So native, non-native, well adapted is more important than whether it happened to be there when Columbus came over. And I'm sure there wasn't a taxonomist on his ship, but we do have good information about where the native ranges are of the native plants in North America. And you'd be surprised that, for instance, honey locust, which is the tree we grow all over the place, very tough tree, was never native in New York. So is that an exotic plant? Yeah, it is, but it does well. And I would hope that we would still use these plants that are well adapted, well mannered, not invasive, and do what we expect them to do.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Can mulches help increase or spread the jumping worm?
Yeah, I know. I think I've heard that mulches and compost and soils can spread it, but I haven't found it much in mulches. They're basically, it's coarse, shredded. I don't see that in there. We haven't had, well, we do have some of that up here, but often can come from nursery stock, from plants and soil, from compost. But I don't think that it's not not only one place or the other. Where you have an infestation of it, you'll get it.
So someone wrote in that they've had have had success using plastic sleeves around young trees planted along the Moodna Creek. And they do that to prevent flooding. And they say they check them twice a year for invasive species and bug infestation. And they use the sleeve to protect the tree from deer.
Right. Yeah, that's a good idea. These are tubes, basically. They're translucent. Generally, sometimes they're tan or whitish. And they're used to put along small trees that will eventually grow out of those. And again, deer, rabbits, any kind of plant, animal that's going to eat the bark or rub the bark is going to kill those trees. And I've done that with some oaks that I had on the Cornell campus, and they were small, and I wanted to protect them from deer, and I kept them on for 3 years, and then I took them off, and they were big enough to fend for themselves. So I think that's a good idea. It's been used a lot in Europe to reforest highway verges and so on. And I think it's a good idea.
So here in Rockland, our annual rainfall is about 50 inches a year. And so someone is asking how much rain or lack of rain is considered drought.
Well, in Ithaca, we got about 36 inches of rain a year. So you're better than us. It's not so much the annual rainfall, it's the rainfall during the growing season. That's the issue. And also the water holding capacity of the soil. The more water you can get into the soil, the lesser you're going to have in terms of drought in the soil. So that's why the scoop and dump, the preparation of soil is so important, because you can get more water holding and get more root infiltration and deep rooting, which is going to avoid drought. Now, having said that, there are times when we have, not just the no rain, but the hot weather, which can exacerbate the drought. And so there are times, especially in the summer, we'll get a spell where it might be hot and 2, 3, 6 weeks of no rain. And then the most you can do is to actually increase the water holding capacity of the soil and mulch it to retain water. And if you have to water, water. But I tend not to plant plants that will need water in the different sites that I work in after they get established. Now, establishment is generally 2 to 3 years, and where they've actually got their roots back in the ground. And if I've chosen correctly, I can choose plants that are more drought resistant, like I mentioned, the cotinus and coleteria, and a whole bunch of plants that can really tolerate drought surprisingly well, whereas others just can't do it. So choosing your plants wisely, and no one's expected to know this. There are hundreds of plants we work with all the time, and so using the database and finding out more plants and cultivars that would work for you is really the way to go.
So let's see. Oh, what is the secret to incorporating bioswales onto major thoroughfares, still leaving room for parking?
Well, I mean, it can be done. I mean, it's really a question of desire for these services to be effective. I know in Brooklyn and Queens, they have bioswales in the sidewalks there. I mean, just basically extending the tree pits and channeling water from the road into those areas, and they've been successful, as opposed to, I mean, long, big thoroughfares. I mean, there's got to be a level of maintenance, or else you just get a woody, sort of a weedy mass, which is maybe something you want. But if you want to have certain plants do well, there's got to be a level of maintenance at least once a year to deal with the weeds. So I don't know how long. I mean, our bioswale we put in was 1/4 mile, and it's doing fine. We do go over it once or twice a year just to keep it in check, but I can't think about a boulevard or a long road, how that would work.
And then finally, someone asked, can a lack of snowfall create a drought?
Can a what snowfall?
A lack.
A lack of snowfall. Well, if you don't get groundwater, basically we expect in the early spring that our soils are full of water as much as they can hold. And then we hope to get rainfall during the season. What we're finding with climate change is that we may get the same amount of rainfall annually, but we'll get it in big bursts, and then we'll get periods of drought between. So it's really a question of how much rainfall there is during the growing season that allows you to grow those plants. Did I answer the question? I'm not sure if I did.
Yes, no, you did. Someone asked, does your database that you have referred to, you mentioned it includes woody plants. Does it also include perennials and annuals?
No, it doesn't not.
Okay.
Yeah. No, it includes about 500 woody plants. Somebody else does the annuals and perennials. There isn't a database at Cornell for the herbaceous plants. I actually teach the herbaceous plants course, but I have enough keeping the woody plant database up to date, so that's the way it goes.
And finally, someone asked, their school district is putting in a new parking area. Is there some guidance available that could help them make it a more sustainable parking lot? What would you recommend?
Well, I would recommend porous paving. I mean, we have a parking lot here at Cornell, and there are several in Ithaca that have porous asphalt. So it looks like sort of rougher asphalt, but water goes right through, and that's a great stormwater technique. So you don't get runoff from the traditional asphalt. And we actually created a parking lot with porous asphalt and with a lower area where plants are, and so all this water goes to that plant area, and it's quite amazing looking plant bed there, because we're channeling the water from the asphalt through the asphalt into the planting bed, and that could be done. I mean, it takes a little bit of money to get porous asphalt versus traditional asphalt. It's not exactly that it's expensive. It's just that when the asphalt plant has to clean out one bay to make a different recipe, that costs a little bit of money for them. There are other types of porous pavings, stone dust and concrete block and so on, but important on those is that they have a reservoir of open graded gravel, so that the water can go through and go to somewhere. If you just put in porous asphalt on soil and the soil is compacted, the water won't go anywhere. So it'll just sit and be a problem. So we use open graded, 1 or 2 stone, number 2 stone, 1 inch sort of gravel, which has a very rapid infiltration rate. And that's important when you're putting porous asphalt on top of it.
Thank you. We do have a porous parking lot here at Lamont Doherty. Part of Columbia has a building. They built a new building probably 5 years ago, and they did incorporate a porous parking lot. So people could take a drive over there and check it out, because it is interesting.
It's very effective, and it actually, people say, well, doesn't snow and ice heave it? But in fact, because you get water away from the surface, we don't get any kind of ice heaving with that.
So one final question. So you talked about choosing the correct plants, and you talked about mulching and a little bit about composting. For the homeowner, are those all equally important? Is one more important than the other?
The most important thing is to prepare the soil. The most important thing. You can have the greatest plant in the world, and if the soil is not penetrable, it doesn't drain, you don't have enough microorganisms in there, the plant won't grow. So I come on the side of prepare the soil, and then your plants will grow great. Of course, it's important to have good plant selection too, but the soil is really the most important thing.
All right, I don't see any other questions. So Dr. Basak, I want to thank you so much for joining us this evening and sharing your knowledge and your extensive experience, and also your website.
Yes, please. And if anybody has any questions, they can email me directly with those. Everybody else does. So, but please use all the resources I have out there.
Okay. Well, again, thank you, Dr. Basak, for joining us tonight.
Thank you for inviting me.
And if people will stay on for a moment, we do have a very brief survey, but thank you for joining us. And we'll let you know when we have our next presentation in July on soils.
Great. Okay.
So thank you all, and have a good evening.
You too.